Ladies and gentlemen, today is October the 31st, 2021. That's why I look like this. And we are about to begin another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Let's see if he's on the line. Hello?
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 Hey. How are you?
I'm doing alright, how are you?
I'm doing okay.
Are you dressed up?
I can't say that I am.
I just dressed
I'm
up.
sorry.
Some people were like, hey, what did you dress up as? And I was like, you have to dress up as something? I just put on a suit jacket.
There you go.
Yeah. Chad was excited to have you on again today. People were asking if there was some main topic for today, but I don't know of anything super big that happened this week. Would anything jump out as like a primary topic?
Not really.
Okay,
Nothing that sticks out to me.
We'll see whatever key thing is taking us on the longest tangent, and we'll call that the main topic. As we normally do, that's the tradition. There was a question about the decline of the Midwest. There is something called Devil's Night, which happened from the 60s through the 90s in Detroit with a bunch of anarchy and arson. But that was the only like pre-Agent Smith sort of question and query.
Hadn't heard of that.
Hmm.
I mean, I've heard of the decline of industry in the Midwest, but I've never heard of Devil's Night.
Hmm. Yeah, they expanded and said, opioid crisis, men not finding work that is satisfying. We did mention that last week with the not finding work, especially blue collar work is more difficult to come by nowadays.
Yeah. Unfortunately so. I mean, the inner city of Detroit really just imploded sort of over the course of the late 20th century, just because so much industry left the city. So that resulted in collapsing property values, collapsing communities, and a corresponding rise in all manner of social ills. Poor educational outcomes, more crime, more violence, just sort of the usual menagerie of misery of one sort or another.
Why did the industries and stuff move out of Detroit?
Um, a couple of reasons, and it's it's kind of a loaded question because it gets politicized a lot. Um, One answer has to do with unions. After World War II, unions in the United States were really strong because US exports obviously were very strong after the war. We didn't have anybody to compete with. Our principal competitors in Europe and Japan were not doing too good after everything that happened in World War II. So the US had a nice little economic golden age immediately after the war, and unions took advantage of that. They used their leverage to get more concessions. And in general, industry was pretty willing to make concessions because they were just making so much money. But by the 60s and 70s, a lot of the promises that were made back in the 50s were no longer sustainable. Stuff like pensions and big, generous healthcare programs, that kind of stuff. It wasn't really affordable anymore for American industry, which at the time was starting to lose ground to international competition, which was more efficient. So part of it has to do with politics and unions. That resulted in the industry there becoming less competitive, and so that resulted in job cuts. Another factor was technology. Just over time, American industry has invested in more efficient production. And an outcome of that is that they don't need as many workers. So that's also led to a significant amount of layoffs. International competition, I kind of already mentioned. American industry just did not invest enough in their future in the 1950s and 60s. And so the result is that they kind of had their lunch eaten. They kind of lost more and more market share. The 70s was really bad because that really made explicit the lack of investment in the product that was being made. In Detroit's case, it was cars. Detroit, for those of you not familiar with American political economy, Detroit is like the center of the automotive industry in the United States, or at least it was historically. So when German cars and Japanese cars started becoming very competitive in the 1960s, American automakers were kind of caught off balance because they hadn't been investing in making their cars all that competitive. And that was bad because that was bad for the 70s, because in the 70s, of course, there was a big energy crisis. The Yom Kippur War and then the Iranian Revolution later in the decade resulted in supply disruptions of oil. And that resulted in massive increases in the price of oil and oil shortages in the United States. So if you're an American consumer and you're driving an American car, you're probably losing a lot of money to gas prices because American cars were not very fuel efficient at that time. Whereas German and Japanese automakers had invested more into fuel efficiency, and so those cars in turn saved you money in terms of fuel, and so were thus much more attractive. So it took a while for US automakers to kind of catch up. So that was another contributing factor to layoffs in Detroit. Another interesting one that I haven't seen talked about as much was highways, or more accurately, freeways. In the 1950s, there was a huge program funded by the federal government to build freeways that would connect all the different regions of the United States all together in a single road network, which kind of existed before. There was a kind of extensive road network before the 50s, but the roads weren't as good. They were generally pretty small, two-lane roads, whatnot. It wasn't great. So the construction of the interstate freeway system in the 1950s really significantly changed the political and economic well, not the political, but the economic geography of the United States, because that made trucking a lot more efficient as a mode of transportation. And one of the results of that is that a lot of not only automakers, but manufacturers in general found it very efficient to move their production out of big cities and push it to lower cost areas that were often not very far away. In some cases, they would move them to other states that were cheap, but sometimes they would just move them to the suburbs. And the result of that reallocation of industry away from inner cities towards suburbs and other sometimes rural areas, generally in the South, resulted in an immense amount of economic dislocation for inner cities, which did not have a ready replacement for that economic activity that was lost with the factories. So it wasn't just factories moving, in some cases overseas, which is more the modern phenomena, or technology or, other factors. In some cases, the factories actually still existed and were still productive. They were just relocated to another location outside of the city, with the result that the city lost a significant portion of its tax base, and as a result suffered a corresponding reduction in public services that reduced quality of living, and kind of created a downward spiral because, as public services were cut, the location became less attractive to investors and workers. And so, in turn, that made economic development crater even further. And so then that kind of just reciprocated until you kind of get the present situation, which is pretty negative. Although it's been improving over the past 10, 20 years. I don't want to kind of badmouth Detroit too much. There have been some improvements, but yeah, in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s in particular, there was definitely a period of rapid decline in which all the factors that I just talked about kind of all accumulated and resulted in significant falls in living standards and basically a demographic and economic collapse within the actual core city itself. If you want an idea of how industry was kind of allocated to suburbs away from inner cities, you can kind of look at the demographics of Detroit. Like if you look at the actual population of Detroit, It's fallen significantly over the past 50 years, as a result, again, of those different factors, basically deindustrialization. But if you look at the population of the Detroit metropolitan area, the population has only declined like 1 or 2%. It hasn't been that much. And actually, if you just look at the suburbs of Detroit, there's actually been population growth. So it's not as though the economy of the Detroit area is just completely imploding. It's more just structural economic changes have resulted in a reallocation of industry that has basically put almost all of the burden of those reallocations on the actual city of Detroit and focused the benefits on the surrounding suburbs. So Detroit is not as bad off as you might think it is if you look at the metro area as a whole. But certainly the inner city suffered significantly, with the result being very, dramatic visual representations of decline. I think the Detroit used to have a really famous what did they call it? Rail center. I don't even remember the technical name. Railroads aren't a big deal in the United States anymore, at least as far as passenger travel. But there used to be like a rail center there that was really well known, and it was really immaculate. It was very expensive and nice. But now it's just, garbage. It's been abandoned, and it's kind of thrown up as a frequent visual example of the decline of Detroit, if not also the decline of the industrial Midwest in general.
So it was the major hub, but it was very expensive. So to be competitive, a bunch of jobs that were historically Detroit jobs were no longer Detroit jobs. So people got the heck out.
Yep. Yeah, it was particularly bad for the African American community there because they couldn't really follow the jobs to the suburbs, because of redlining and, prejudice in general, and other such practices. They were kind of stuck in Detroit, so to speak. And as a result, the burden, the social burden, so to speak, of the deindustrialization of Detroit fell disproportionately, not only on the inner city of Detroit, but on African American communities in Detroit, which is how it kind of ended up becoming ghettoized, so to speak. And that was a phenomena you can see in a lot of places in the industrial Midwest. Chicago is a paramount example. Uh, you know, any number of other industrial cities that generally smaller but have similar phenomena where African American communities dominate the inner city but not in the suburbs and are generally poorer because their communities were ghettoized in the 1960s and 70s deindustrialization. So something to keep in mind when talking about statistics. People like to point out, that statistics for educational attainment and, income and other measures of progress and prosperity for the African American community generally underperform other groups in the United States. But part of that, if not a significant part of that, is spatial. Uh, that is to say that the communities in these deindustrialized areas, which suffered from a combination of deindustrialization and prejudice that prevented them from responding to it in a way that could have preserved their wealth, uh, that impact has a disproportionate impact on statistics like that. That is to say, educational attainment, income, etc. So it's not fair per se to paint the entire community, to paint those statistics as being indicative of some kind of innate inability on the part of the community. A lot of that just is structural economic changes and prejudice and other such factors, which basically created a ghettoized, focused bubble of poverty that entrapped, large numbers of communities across the United States. But you don't really see that readily in statistics, especially when you get aggregated statistics that just kind of throw lots of different African American groups all together and try to present them as just being one singular group, when in fact there's many different communities, all of which have different economic histories and different political histories, and just all of which kind of manifest in those statistics. Well, what did we have? Was there anything in the news that kind of caught your eye?
Mm, not particularly. We have our local elections here in Washington, but nothing too out of the ordinary.
Okay. Well, when was the last time we talked about Eastern Europe?
It's been a bit. We've mentioned Crimea a few times, especially comparing and contrasting that with Taiwan.
Okay. So not much. Well, there's not a whole lot that's really changed, but it might be worth it just to kind of give a brief update on some stuff. Search, So Poland has been in trouble again, unsurprisingly. They've been in trouble off and on for much of the past 10 years because their government, for reasons we've kind of talked about a number of times before, is something of a right-wing populist government, which has a somewhat uneasy relationship with the European Union. And that has to do with what you might call illiberal democracy and practices corresponding therein. The Polish government lately has been getting in trouble for some judicial reforms that it made, or at least some new ones. They've made other ones that got them into trouble, but the most recent batch created a kind of oversight committee that was meant to ensure that Polish judges uh, were basically implementing the law in the quote unquote correct way. And that's kind of a simplification. Actually, it just had to do with oversight in general, but it was widely assumed that the process of oversight would be politicized such that anti-government judges would be removed and pro-government judges given favor. So that resulted in a lawsuit that ended up before the European Court of Justice. And the European Court of Justice, well, more accurately, in the hearings within the European Court of Justice over this, the Polish government made the case that, in effect, Polish law supersedes European Union law in some cases, specifically with regard to the judicial laws in question. And so that created a big political clusterfuck in Europe because, of course, the whole purpose of the European Union and European Union law is that it's supranational. It's supposed to supersede national laws. Of course, that doesn't always mean much since the European Union is kept purposely weak, specifically so that doesn't become too much of a problem. But in so much as the European Union is expected to work as a single market and a single political decision-making body, European Union law does technically have to supersede those of the member states. So for a member state to say, no, that's not the case, basically upends the whole sort of foundation of the European Union and its legal superstructure. So the European Union was not happy about that, unsurprisingly. And so there's been talk about sanctions being brought against Poland, not economic sanctions per se, but rather legal sanctions that correspond with a failure to respect whichever European Union law is being violated. So in this case, the law in question that kind of brought the whole case before the EU uh, was basically alleged by the European Union of breaching requirements that states respect rule of law and maintain independent judiciaries. So the sanctions for that, in the most extreme form, involve a suspension of voting rights within the European Union. But the European Union has threatened that before with regard to other problems they've had with Poland, but they've never actually done anything about it. And generally, these issues get negotiated away, or the can gets kicked down the road. They delay dealing with it ad infinitum. So the European Union hasn't really been able to deal with Poland and some of the behavior that they don't like. And Poland, in turn, basically, well, more accurately, the Polish government in power right now basically just kind of keeps doing things that violate, or at least that the European Union thinks violates, rule of law provisions. So that issue has not been resolved yet, and there's been some drama within the European Union over that. We'll see what comes of it. Probably nothing, given the European Union's track record, but something to keep an eye on, if nothing else. Let's see. So that was Poland. And then you've heard of the Czech Republic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Formerly
so that
known
was
as Czechoslovakia.
well, that it was one of the two states
Yeah.
formerly. Yeah, it was broken into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and both of them together were comprised Czechoslovakia. And then, yeah, like you say, the Czech Republic was one of the successor states. Uh, so they don't make the news very much. They're generally pretty quiet. But they were in the news recently because of a possible constitutional crisis. I haven't read an update on this in the past week, so there might have been new developments. But basically, the president of the Czech Republic was incapacitated just after they had an election recently. And that created some problems because after an election is held, technically it's the responsibility of the president to form a new government, or at least to allow the formation of a new government. So there was some question about what should happen, uh, given that he was unable to fulfill that role. Yeah, in the election, the incumbent political party lost. That was the ANO, which I don't know what stands for. Maybe somebody in chat more familiar with them can tell me. But the ANO was the incumbent party, and then the opposition coalition, which was called SPOLU, were able to just win out somewhat a few more seats than them. Now, the way the law is written, it's kind of at the discretion of the president which political party or coalition they give the first chance to form a coalition to. And in this case, the president had said before the election that whichever party won the most votes would receive the first opportunity to form a government. That doesn't mean they would inevitably be the next government. It just means they would have the chance to build a coalition in order to do so. But it's significant that he decided that the biggest party would get the first opportunity because the coalition technically was larger. That is to say, won more seats than the incumbent political party. But the coalition is comprised of multiple political parties, whereas the incumbent political party is basically just a single political party. So invariably, the incumbent party won more votes than any other party. That wasn't surprising. So the president was kind of implicitly biased in favor of the incumbent by making that decision. The coalition easily, could have been predicted to win somewhat more votes before the election. So coming out and saying that you're not going to give first opportunity to the coalition, that kind of favors the incumbent a little bit there. Again, not inevitable that the ruling incumbent party would have been able to form a government anyway. Again, the coalition opposition was able to get more votes, so it may have been that they would have been able to deny that party a government and would have ended up in power anyway. But anyway, the president said that he wasn't that he was going to give the nod basically to the ANO. And so that's what should have happened. But instead, he was incapacitated due to a medical problem immediately after the election. And so there was a big hullabaloo about who forms the next government, and there was, I think, some chicanery going.
Do you mean like he was incapacitated by opponents, or
No,
they
no,
don't know how to follow the procedure?
it was a legitimate medical problem. The
Oh.
chicanery had to do with an attempt to pass off an order from the president, to pass off an order that was implemented in the name of the president as having been written by the president when actually it was written by an underling who may have forged his signature. And I'm trying to check my notes here to see what specifically that order was. Yeah, it was significant because the director of the Central Military Hospital, where the president was staying at, specifically came out and said that he was incapable of fulfilling any of his working responsibilities. That's a direct quote. Uh, so he clearly was incapacitated. But there was a letter. Here it is. There was a letter that was supposedly signed by the president, but which may not have been. It was passed off as being signed by the president by his senior aide, a guy named Vratislav Minar. And he was escorted. No, he escorted the lower house chair, Radek Vondracek, to see the president. in his ICU unit, and they were hoping to get a signature while they were there. The visit wasn't approved by the hospital director. But anyway, they emerged from the IC unit with a letter that that's what it was. The letter was to reconvene Parliament by 8th of November. So that would have kind of circumvented the constitutional crisis, since they would have been able to get Parliament back and they could have gone through all the necessary procedures and whatnot to form a government. But the allegation here is that the signature on the letter was forged and that the president actually wasn't capable of doing that. Now, I'm not sure who this really benefits. If they did forge the signature, does that mean that the incumbent political party is somehow advantaged? I'm not sufficiently familiar with Czech politics to know that, so I would refer to chat to that. I guess this would be a good time for the usual disclaimer. Obviously, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about, including Czech politics. So if I ever get anything wrong, stupid, if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, I would encourage chat to please correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. And I do learn a lot from chat after that. I don't read chat while we do this because I can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, but participation is encouraged. But yeah, I'm not an expert here on just who would benefit from this, but this has been the drama in the Czech Republic for the past couple weeks. It's not clear whether or not the president is capable of fulfilling his duties, and there may have been some chicanery about reconvening the government.
I can only imagine what would happen if there was some issue like that in the US around our election, as scuffed as it already was.
Well, no kidding. Trying to remember a word. Like if you go to see a doctor and he says that he's going to send you to another doctor, then what is he doing? I want to say he refers you to the other doctor, but I think there's another word for that.
Referring you to a specialist. Everyone's saying referral in the chat, so I think you're correct. Or we're all wrong together, which can also happen.
Well, maybe I was thinking of the word consult. I would consult chat. Defer, that's the word I wanted. I would defer to chat on the significance of the Czech political crisis I just talked about. That's the word. I got tripped up over that. I kept thinking refer, but I was trying to think of defer. Proofreader problems. Sorry. That kind of stuff kind of catches me sometimes. So let's see. So we talked about Poland. We talked about the Czech Republic, or Czechia, depending on which name you prefer. And then I think there was some drama in Bosnia. Yeah, for the past couple years, the president of, I think he's president, maybe he's prime minister of Republika Srpska has been trying to cause trouble. I don't know how familiar everybody is with politics in Bosnia, but basically, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the civil war in Bosnia. There was a civil war in Bosnia in the early 90s. It was a part of the sort of overarching series of Yugoslav wars. And, skipping ahead, a lot of stuff happened, and as part of the peace agreement, Bosnia was more or less cut in half. And there was one government roughly in the south, which was the Bosniak Croat Federation, if I'm not mistaken. And then there was a government in the north that was for the ethnic Serb population called Republika Srpska. And there was also a single national government that had power over, both territories, that was actually run by the European Union, if I'm not mistaken. And that sort of peace agreement has been meant to kind of allow different ethnic communities to have their own polities while maintaining the territorial integrity of Bosnia as a whole. Because to kind of, review a little bit of the Yugoslav wars, the ethnic Serbs in Bosnia basically wanted either to break away and join with Serbia or to conquer Bosnia and keep it as part of Yugoslavia. Those were kind of the two principal objectives there. And I'm not an expert on the Yugoslav wars, so if we have anybody in chat more familiar, please do elaborate on this for me. But in general, that's my impression. So that was sort of the gist of the war, and creating Republika Srpska kind of met some of the demand for Serb autonomy in Bosnia without destroying Bosnia outright. So that's been more or less a workable status quo for the past couple decades. But there hasn't really been sufficient momentum towards resolving the underlying tension there. Because as is, the political tension in the country has more been frozen than it has been resolved. And recently, in the past couple of years, Serbian nationalists have been becoming more and more rancorous. They've been challenging the European Union's right to govern the territory. They've been challenging laws passed at the national level in Bosnia. And in general, they've just been trying to undermine the peace agreement and trying to break away, or at least signaling that they want to break away. Whether or not they actually mean it is debatable. So there's been some drama in Bosnia recently because the prime minister, no, not the prime minister, some outside powers basically did not approve, did not vote to renew at the UN, the European Union's sort of authority to continue governing Bosnia at the national level. And again, that was Russia and China principally that failed to vote to renew the UN's authority. I don't know that the EU is going to pull out without UN authority. They may just stay anyway, but basically Russia and China are kind of cooperating with Republika Srpska leadership there and trying to undermine the authority of the EU. So that's kind of a new development. And in general, there's been more Chinese and Russian involvement in politics in the Balkans over the past 10 years, the past 5 years in particular. China in particular has been making a lot of investments as part of its Belt and Road project. And I've even read a fairly convincing article that Chinese influence in Serbia now is actually greater than Russian influence, which is a pretty dramatic change. Historically, Russian influence was greater, if only because of the common sort of pan-Slav unity, which is generally a pretty common facet of Balkans politics. That goes back hundreds of years to when Russia was trying to liberate the Balkans from Ottoman rule. But more recently, Russian influence has generally come in the form of natural gas, which is the principal form of energy used in the Balkans for things like heating, if not also industry. So that's given the Moscow a lot of influence in the Balkans that they've used to considerable effect, although less so in the past couple years since the Europeans started negotiating as a bloc for Russian gas imports. But for Chinese investment to become significant enough to displace that traditional Russian influence really gives you an idea of just how much geopolitics are changing. So one of the manifestations of that influence is the drama in Bosnia lately. They've also been kind of pushing Serbia a little bit to, I guess they don't want to stop them from joining NATO and the European Union. I'm sure Russia does, but I don't think China cares as much. But there's been a lot of investment in Serbia as kind of the avatar for Russo-Chinese influence in the Balkans, in particular, more so than in sort of surrounding states. That's not to say there hasn't also been investment in other states. China invested in the construction of a very large modern port in Thessalonica. I mean, it was already a large port, but they modernized it and it's become a significant vector for imports into continental Europe. And they've also been trying to build up a rail and I think maybe also a canal network along the Danube that would sort of connect by way of infrastructure a number of trans-Danubian states like Hungary, Serbia, etc. And if they actually finished that, that would have a pretty significant impact on the economic geography of Europe, because right now the infrastructure in the Balkans is relatively poor. And so the Balkans, as a result, isn't really all that well integrated into the economy of the rest of Europe. So all of that would give the Chinese, and in so much as they're involved, the Russians, significantly more influence in the region. Still not entirely clear just what they would do with that influence. Right now, it's mostly just playing a spoiler role. There was a coup attempt in Montenegro a couple years ago that was strongly suspected to have been connected to Russian involvement somehow. And it was thought that that attempt was largely about trying to block Montenegro's accession into NATO, which of course Russia has some interest in. Although I don't know that Montenegro by itself is really important enough to warrant such intervention. It's a pretty tiny state, but it's more the principle of the thing when it comes to Moscow. They just don't like the idea of NATO expansion in the Balkans in general, regardless of how small the states involved may be. And they also supposedly, allegedly, were involved in pushing a lot of, I don't know if I would call it misinformation per se, but there was definitely a big information campaign, let's put it like that, in Macedonia around the time when they were trying to get into NATO in order to put pressure on the government to basically not do so. Um, they would have failed if not for the fact that France vetoed Macedonian rather, Macedonian accession into NATO, with the result that they kind of got knocked back to square one, and a number of parties that were opposed to NATO accession in turn were able to gain more influence, if not get into power. I don't quite remember the fallout from that exactly, but certainly it was a Russian win in their book anyway. So there's been a fair amount of shenanigans in the Balkans over the past bit, and it seems only set to accelerate going forward. I think we also talked about those mysterious explosions. I think supposedly that was linked to arms traffickers trying to get weapons to rebels in Syria. So allegedly, the Russians were involved trying to stop weapons going to rebels that would have attacked their ally, that being the Syrian government. And there was a couple depots of weapons that were blown up. I don't think. I think in one case they didn't mean for it to blow up. I think they meant for it to blow up like in another country or something, and it accidentally went off in Europe. So there was some consternation over, Russian espionage as a result. But European consternation over Russian espionage isn't any more effective now than it has been at any point in the past 10 years, i.e., not very much. So I don't know that they're going to be able to deter future such examples. But that is how bold Russia has gotten in exerting influence in Eastern Europe. They've certainly been dialing it up over the past 5 years.
We're receiving a great deal of espionage. What should we do, sir? Well, I think we should look upon them with consternation.
Well, they had the whole Novichok thing in London, and they had the assassination attempt on Navalny, and all these other kinds of examples. But the Europeans never really quite seem able to significantly punish them for it. Pretty much the only thing they've got going are the sanctions. And sanctions are pretty impactful, especially given how large Europe's economy is. But I mean, it doesn't seem to have done much as far as deterring Moscow. I think we already talked about Russian involvement in Africa, how they're kind of trying to displace French influence and traditionally French spheres of influence in Africa. Again, I don't know how much Russia really gains by all of this because, countries in the Balkans are strategically located, but they're not very prosperous, and a lot of them have problems with dysfunction and corruption. And the same can be said for a lot of the countries in Africa that Russia is trying to build relationships with. So they are expanding their influence, but the allies that they're getting are not like big powers. It's not clear to me that they're really getting much strategic traction out of the effort. But I guess when you're sanctioned as much as Russia is, and you're as desperate as the Putin patronage network is getting, I guess you can't really be too picky. So, in so much as that's a fair representation, maybe Russian influence operations are just more about trying to scrap by as best they can rather than trying to build some kind of new empire or some such. I guess if we're going to talk about Russia, we can talk about OPEC now. Because Russia is not a member of OPEC, but it is a member of what's come to be called OPEC Plus. And OPEC Plus is kind of evolving into the new arbiter of energy prices around the world. I don't know how much commitment Russia really has towards OPEC Plus, but at least for the moment, they've largely adhered to the promises they've made. But the new thing with OPEC, though, is that they agreed to a new mechanism by which to police their members. The thing about being a part of a cartel is that you want to suppress production in order to raise prices and increase revenue. Well, so long as your good is price inelastic. If the good that you're selling actually has a elastic price elasticity of demand, then that doesn't really work. You would actually lose money. But demand for oil doesn't change much with changes in price. People kind of need it regardless of what the price is. So cutting production results in a net increase in revenue for OPEC producers, for OPEC members, rather. So the problem with that is that there's always an incentive then to cheat, because if everybody in the group cuts production, then you can stand to pick up market share and pick up significantly more revenue if you don't honor your commitment to cut production. So historically, that's been a problem for OPEC. In the 1980s, in particular, there was an almost total collapse in cooperation amongst OPEC members that resulted in the Saudis punishing everybody by just pumping out production. And the Saudis can produce oil at a cheaper cost, rather. They can produce oil at a cheaper cost than any other OPEC member, such that they can sell it at a lower price and still break even. So when the Saudis want to punish other OPEC members, they just pump out production and sell it at a price that is actually below cost for other OPEC members. And they did that through most of the 80s and a good chunk of the 90s as well. I think actually all of the 90s, pretty much. A very long time, basically. And then they kind of got their mojo back when prices went up in the aughts. But then more recently, around 2014, I want to say, prices collapsed again and have been relatively low ever since. So
Why
the new
have the prices
mechanism
not gone
Sorry?
back up?
It's been going back up like the past year or two as a result of the global economic recovery from COVID. And it's kind of ticked up over time as well as the general global economy has improved over the past, 10 years. Because obviously prices tanked after 2008 with the financial crisis. But then they kind of came back up pretty quickly after that. But then the 2014 price war happened and they collapsed. And so they've kind of been pretty volatile, but in general low since 2014. And then, of course, prices tanked again in 2020 with COVID, and in 2021, they've been recovering pretty strongly. But the new mechanism that they agreed to in order to try to make sure members don't cheat involves basically members committing to cutting production in the future in order to make up for revenues gained for cheating in the past. So you may cheat in the present and increase production when you're supposed to cut production. But once it's found out that you did that, you have a commitment then, according to this new agreement, to significantly cut production even more than you would otherwise, in effect, giving up revenue in order to make up for the revenue that you gained when you were cheating. And basically, you just have to keep doing that until all of the ill-gotten revenue from when you were cheating is compensated for by the disproportionate production cuts in the future. So nominally, that should mean that there's less cheating in the future and that oil prices stay relatively high in future, even if there's geopolitical tension or economic dislocation that might generally encourage, as it has in the past, cheating that's resulted in a collapse of the cartel's ability to control prices.
I think we talked maybe a couple of years ago during an Agent Smith about Venezuela, who is currently cheating, and then they got immediately punished. But that was before this agreement.
Yeah, that would have been before. Yeah, Venezuela is an example of why a country would be incentivized to cheat because the economy collapsed spectacularly, mid-decade, and they really needed that revenue. And so cheating made a lot of sense to them, and they couldn't really resist. And as a result, they got hammered. Venezuela was not the reason that the price war happened in 2014, though. That had more to do with Iran. The Saudis and Iran have something of a Cold War going on in the Middle East. And 2014 was sort of the middle of the nuclear negotiations between the United States and Iran. So the Saudis kind of, maybe not completely, but implicitly wanted to sabotage those talks. And they did little things here and there to do that. And, the price war was kind of one of those things, probably. It's kind of hard to prove entirely. And I've heard different explanations for the price war. I've also heard that the Saudis wanted to undermine U.S. shale producers because the cost of producing oil shale is pretty high. So they need a higher price in order to break even and turn a profit. So if the Saudis can tank oil prices for an extended period, that could knock out a significant number of oil shale producers in the U.S. And the Saudis would want that to happen so that they could preserve market share. Market share is everything for oil producers. So even if the Saudis can technically still make money, even with the presence of oil shale producers, if they're losing market share to oil shale producers, they're still going to lose money over the long run. So it's better from their perspective to try to destroy that market as much as possible. Well, destroy that industry rather as much as possible, so they can preserve as much of their market share as possible. So that's another explanation for the price war I've heard. But generally, I find the Iranian price war explanation more convincing, just because of the overarching nuclear negotiation that was happening and the rampeting up of tension between the Saudis and Iranians that happened in the latter part of the Obama administration. But Venezuela cheating didn't help, so that was at least a contributing factor.
I've heard there's a lot of oil still just around the world in places where it hasn't really been harvested fully. Like I think there's a lot in Africa. There's a bunch of natural gas and things in the US and Canada.
Yeah, there's a lot of oil reserves around the world, and probably if we invested more in exploration, we would find more. But the trend is not sort of in that direction. With the environmental movement where it is, uh, there's been a significant amount of discouragement at the official and unofficial level uh, to try to prevent further oil exploration. And the result has been something of a stagnation in known oil reserves, among other types of reserves. Yeah, there's been policy disincentives to investing in the oil industry and investing in oil exploration. And then, of course, there's a lot of pressure from consumers and civil society not to do that, with the result that a number of workers who actually work in the industry in question have put pressure on the company not to do that. And shareholders also have put pressure on the companies involved not to explore like that and to kind of shift gears to focus more on lowering emissions and investing in renewable energy sources. So yeah, there's a lot of oil reserves out there, but it's getting harder and harder to exploit them largely for policy reasons, but also due to activism.
It's less of a sexy, positive energy source than it used to be. Early days of oil, it was just like liquid gold, is how they described it basically. If there's no downside, it's just incredible that you found this. And now it's more so, hey, do we have a climate change problem? Maybe we do. Is it human caused? Maybe it is. Who's causing a lot of this? Maybe it's them. Did you see I think we mentioned this in one of the previous Agent Smiths. The journalist group who basically trolled and tricked some super high up guy in ExxonMobil, and he just like spilled the beans on a whole bunch of stuff of like, oh yeah, we knew that we were creating environmental concerns and this and that, just like fully admitting stuff, thinking that they were about to score some oil mogul in Saudi Arabia or something, when really it was just a bunch of journalists like, I can't believe he's saying this shit. This is great. Keep him talking.
Yeah, there's also been a lot more activism in the form of investigative journalism to try to explore the oil industry's impact on the environment and their history of research into that impact. So there's been a lot more stories like that and a lot more efforts to uncover information relevant to that. There's been hearings lately in the past couple weeks that have kind of been excoriating the industry, specifically for a lack of action that they could have taken much earlier in response to research they were doing that suggested that they were going to have that their operations were emitting, carbon dioxide and whatnot, and that it was going to have a climate impact. I don't know that it's entirely fair to say they were covering it up. I don't know how much that's true. It's probably more just like they didn't give a shit.
Well, I don't think it's covering it up. It's more so playing dumb, because if you're the one who's doing a study on something, you can always say that the results are not conclusive or whatever. And then you can also just say, and this is a really standard thing that a lot of people do, you say that you're conducting an investigation. That's one of the public's favorites to reference now. Oh, maybe there is a climate issue. We'll conduct an investigation. And it's like, shh, I don't actually do anything.
Yeah, they've been pretty cagey. No surprise.
Yeah, well,
Pretty much exactly.
why would you ruin your empire by saying, yes, actually what we're doing, it's messing up the environment, so we're just gonna close the doors. You've got a lot of money at stake here.
Yeah.
So their goal number one is probably going to be protect that investment.
Yeah, it's exactly what I would expect. It's no shock to me that they would do that. So it kind of comes more down to political forces to do something about it, and we'll see. American politics is not particularly proactive at this point, so I don't know how much will realistically be done. But certainly there's a lot more information about the subject than there used to be on account of the shift in public sentiment and the greater availability of information about culpability on the part of industry. What else do we have here? Oh, did you want to? We talked about Europe, and I guess I don't have too much to add to that. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm probably missing something. I don't mean to skip over anybody, but I've only got so much room in my memory. If there's something dramatic happening in your country in Europe and I missed it, please post it in chat. I'd certainly be interested in hearing from you. Or posting it in the YouTube comments if this does end up on YouTube. The YouTube comments are always fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lots of engagement on the last couple ones. That's been really fun to read those.
Yeah. I had my major breakthrough maybe a couple months ago after having, honestly, a YouTube troll regular who just consistently would shit on my videos and talk about how it wasn't a good enough game to make a video and that I would be so much better if I did X, Y, and Z. And I was like, man, it's just never good enough for this guy. And then I was like, holy shit, he's feeding the algorithm and helping my channel consistently, week by week. I was like, yes!
There you go. Yeah, I can't please everybody. Let's see. So do you want to do Japan next?
Sure. We did get a couple questions, but we can talk
okay.
about
Let's do
Japan
that
too.
then. Let's see. What are your thoughts on Argentina $45 billion debt with the IMF? Yeah, Argentina's been having a rough time. I've actually got them in my notes here. It was one of the topics I was going to bring up. Let's see where it is. Down. So, for those of you who haven't been following Argentine politics, which is probably most of you, understandably so, Argentina has been trying to negotiate a significant debt deal with the IMF. They've been trying to get a loan, basically, because they've been having a lot of problems with inflation and with, as you can imagine, debt. They've already defaulted on their debt. I think they did that in 2020. Again, it's not the first time. Argentina is kind of known for defaulting on debt. But the latest iteration was in 2020. And the Argentine government has been kind of struggling to try to handle the fallout of that. Because obviously, if you're going to default on your debt, investors don't have much incentive to lend you further money. So the Argentine government has been short, and that's been causing, a fall in the availability of public services since they've had to make cuts here and there. And they've also been implementing a whole slew of different policies in order to try to curtail the export of hard currency. One of the things they did was a restriction on the export of beef and whatnot. Well, actually, that probably hurts them in that regard. It's kind of hard for Argentina because Argentina's government is kind of populist. So on the one hand, they want to deal with the debt crisis, which means restricting the outflow of hard currency. But at the same time, they don't want to make life harder for their constituents. And so they've also been implementing measures that try to reduce price increases in order to lessen the impact on consumers. But those generally hurt the economy also, such that the economic crisis is exacerbated. So they're kind of juggling economic populism with economic consequences, so to speak. And it hasn't really been a winning combination for them thus far. So the export restrictions I were talking about, they tried to restrict the export of beef because beef was becoming much more expensive, and of course that's a big staple in Argentina. And of course you don't want food to be out of reach for your poorest citizens, but at the same time, beef is a major export item for Argentina that generates a lot of hard currency. And if you're restricting your exports, then that means you're restricting hard currency inflow, and that just makes the whole debt crisis currency crisis even worse. So, in order to deal with that, they've been trying to negotiate a loan with the IMF that I think, would be denominated in dollars, I would assume. That would give them a nice influx of hard currency that they could use to pay down debts and otherwise pay for this, that, or the other obligation on the part of the Argentine state. And I would assume that the IMF would prefer that that loan be tied to structural reforms, such that the Argentine economy could start recovering of its own accord and generating hard currency and generating exports and whatnot, basically just growing naturally and organically on its own, such that the Argentine government could just pay its own way without having to depend on IMF bailouts or foreign loans or what have you. I haven't been following the story super closely, so I don't know how the negotiations have progressed. The phrasing of the question kind of suggests that the loan has already been negotiated. So I assume then that whatever deal the IMF wanted to strike has been struck. So I don't know what conditions and caveats and whatnot they required. It probably wouldn't be as bad as others that they've negotiated. The IMF in general has become a lot less strict over time. Back in the day, back in the 90s, they were known as kind of being the avatar of neoliberalism because they would demand very steep cuts to public spending and extensive structural reforms to the economy in exchange for any kind of bailout loan. But they noticed over time that generally what would happen is that the state receiving the loan would implement the necessary required changes, get the loan, and then would end up either not implementing structural reforms or they would end up basically just failing anyway. There would be significant public backlash to public spending cuts, and they would end up increasing spending later on and reversing this, that, or the other structural reform. Basically, the political demands being made of the recipient nations were not politically viable in the medium to long term, to the point where whatever economic gains might be incurred from full implementation of those reforms were never fully realized. And so the IMF noted that, and they've been much more conciliatory about structural reforms and other demands required in exchange for loans ever since. So that's some meta commentary there that that the whatever agreement has been made with Argentina is probably not as strict as past such agreements. But anyway, yeah, I think it's good that the Argentines were able to get the loan, if indeed they have fully negotiated it. But, like any economist would say, if you don't deal with the structural problems with the economy, you're just going to have to do the same thing again 5, 10 years down the line. There has to be significant and real structural reform of the Argentine economy, and most likely significant cuts to public spending, since those are one of the biggest contributors to the devaluation of the Argentine currency. So without those kinds of changes, the Argentine's economy and its public policy are not going to be able to handle uh, a recurrence. They're not going to be able to prevent a recurrence of this problem in the near to medium term. Well, in the medium to long term, rather. In the near term, it'll be fine. Things should stabilize in the short term. If I had to guess, and I do, I suspect that the government in power right now, which is a Peronist populist government, is probably gambling that global prices will rise such that the commodities that the Argentine economy depends on in order to float its economy, again, beef and other, agricultural type products, such that those prices will rise enough that exports will significantly increase and the Argentine government can just tax that and cover their costs. That's basically what happened after 2001. The Argentine economy pretty much collapsed in 2001 owing to a debt crisis, kind of similar to this one. And the only reason they were ever able to recover is because commodity prices significantly increased over the course of the global economic boom that happened in the aughts. And that was enough to pull the economy of Argentina out of recession. And it happened without the Argentine government having to give significant concessions or make significant structural reforms. But that was only going to last as long as commodity prices stayed high. And of course, in 2008, they didn't. And so that punched a hole in the Argentine budget. They were able to kind of delay things for a while after that. But eventually, chickens came home to roost, so to speak. And a couple years ago, the economy entered a period of significant inflation. And the Argentine government wasn't able to implement the reforms necessary to stop that, even though they actually had a conservative president for a while. He didn't have enough power in Congress in Argentina in order to push through, further reforms. And so they ended up where they are now with a debt default and an IMF bailout. So I imagine they're hoping for a reoccurrence of the commodities boom of the aughts in order to kind of save them and preclude them from having to implement, difficult and painful political changes that their constituents are not going to like. But whether or not that's actually going to work in practice is pretty debatable. I mean, yes, it's true there's a global economic recovery. Commodity prices are increasing, so that definitely should help them. But prices are also relatively volatile, and COVID has been really unpredictable. The economic impact of COVID has pretty much been a question mark from day one. And that's a problem for industry because they need to be able to project in the future what their demand is going to be like in order to plan appropriately. And because COVID keeps screwing up their long-term plans, they keep getting caught off balance, and it's cost them a lot of money. So Argentina could, in the event of a COVID-related swing in the market of some kind, find that the commodity price increase that they're banking on fails them. In which case, again, they're just going to be back to square one, trying to negotiate, another bailout or another debt default of some kind. Yeah, I think we get a lot more South American engagement than we do from other regions, relatively speaking. Obviously, North America is the principal one, but I've noted that we tend to get more engagement from South America. So, hello and thank yous to all of our South American listeners. You're all much appreciated.
The Latin America StarCraft scene is quite strong as well. So I think those are somewhat connected.
Let's see. I guess since we're talking about Argentina, I can, we'll get to the other question here in a minute, but since we're talking about Argentina, I thought maybe I'd just skip over and briefly take a look at the Argentina notes here. Yeah, for some more specific information about Argentina's economy, Their GDP fell by 10% in 2020, and inflation is running at 50% per annum. So that means the prices of everything, roughly everything anyway, on average, increases by 50% every year, which is a lot. That's a whole lot. You're going to get a lot of shoe leather cost out of that. Shoe leather cost is a economics term that refers to the cost of having to kind of constantly buy stuff, to go to the store and buy stuff as quickly as possible in order to buy stuff ahead of price increases. Because the more that prices increase, the more incentive do you have to buy now rather than later. And if prices are increasing dramatically like they are in Argentina, you have a significant incentive to go out to the store every day and buy stuff that you need rather than kind of delaying until later. Because if you wait until later, it's going to be way, way more expensive. Another thing that Argentina has been doing is seigniorage. They've actually been printing money to try to finance their budget deficit. That's guaranteed to cause inflation, pretty much. I know the MMT people don't think so, but I'm pretty sure they're wrong. And Argentina seems to be a case in point. So that's the economic data that I have in my notes here. Politically speaking, the Peronists are in power right now, but regional elections in the past year have not gone well for them. So there's a lot of pressure right now on the government to kind of do more in order to appease voters. And it's kind of a weird situation right now. Sort of the leading political figure among the Peronists is a woman named Kirchner. I think her first name is Christina, if I'm not mistaken. Christina, so her name is Christina Kirchner. And she had been president, I think, before for a while, and then her husband actually had been president before her, but he died in office, and he ended up succeeding him. So this sort of Kirchner dynasty has been governing in Argentina for a while, and they're pretty much the leading populists in Argentina. So she could not run for re-election, I believe, due to term limits, if I'm not mistaken. And so they had ran a new guy in order to... No, that's not what it was. Kirchner lost re-election to a conservative guy. I don't remember his name, but he was president for just one term. And they ran, instead of Kirchner, they ran somebody else. I think his name is Guzman? No, not Guzman. I guess I don't have his name, but the current sitting president is the guy they ran instead. And he was able to defeat the conservatives. But he's marginally more moderate than Kirchner is. So there's been some political tension between him and the other moderates in the party and the more populist wing of the party that's led by Kirchner. And so the recent underperformance in regional elections really brought out that tension. So there was a big cabinet reshuffle that was suspected to have been largely instigated by Kirchner. She apparently published a letter criticizing the government and specific ministers, and then a bunch of those ministers that were criticized ended up getting kicked out of the government, basically. The only one who wasn't kicked out pretty much was the economy minister. That was the guy named Guzman, Minister Guzman. He stayed on, and it was thought that he was kept on because he was the kind of leading the way on the IMF negotiations, which at that time were still going on. And just a cute anecdote here, there was a leaked conversation between one of Kirchner's allies, a woman, I guess, named Fernanda Valle. I don't speak Spanish, so I apologize if I butchered the pronunciation here. I'm going to say her name is Fernanda Vallejos. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I probably am. She's a finance committee chair. So Fernanda there had a conversation leaked in which she is heard describing I guess Fernandez is his name, President Fernandez. He's described as a quote-unquote squatter in the presidential palace who is, quote, deaf, blind, and a clown.
So she's not a fan then?
Not a fan. Not a fan. So that just illustrates that divide in the party between the populists and the moderates there. And there's a strong sense that President Fernandez and the other moderates really should not be in government, that it's kind of a fluke that they're in government in the first place, and really Kirchner and her people should be in the lead there. Let's Let's see. Yeah, that's pretty much all I had on Argentina there. So that's just a brief snapshot of Argentine politics in, I guess, 2021, I want to say, is when I would have taken the notes here. Yeah, Argentina's never really been able to kind of deal with Peronism in Argentine politics. It's not to say they've never done anything good. It's just that a lot of the stuff that they've done has contributed to economic disaster of one sort or another. And that goes back to the beginning. That goes way back to when Juan Perón himself was in power, way back in the 1940s. It just kind of seems like they can't get out of their own way. Let's see. So that was Argentina. So then the next question. My home value has gone up over 30% in the 5 years I've owned it. Nice. I feel like it's not sustainable. What do you think the housing market will do over the next 10 or so years? I'm not an expert in real estate. As an economist, I've never studied real estate. My ex-girlfriend actually did. She would probably know better than me. I don't know how willing she would be to talk about it, though. But yeah, I don't. Any projections I would make here, take it with a grain of salt, basically.
Do the
this
opposite.
isn't my area. What?
Whatever I tell you now, I'm probably wrong, so just play it safe and do the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's probably not sustainable, but it may not have to be. It's not inevitable that the factors driving prices higher are going to just disappear and cause a collapse of prices. So it may be more that when factors driving the price increases are removed, that prices just stagnate or increase at a more normal rate rather than just collapse downward. There actually is decent reason for housing prices to increase dramatically. I don't know if you guys have heard of the echo boom, but in demographics, there's this idea of a echo boom, which is basically a significant increase in population that stems from a boom in births amongst baby boomers. And maybe I didn't phrase that great, but there was a explosion in the birth rate in the 1940s and 50s. And the generation that was birthed as a result, the kids that came out of that were baby boomers. Now, what happened is that the baby boomers themselves had children. And because the baby boom generation was so large, that cohort of children that were born from the baby boomers itself represents a demographic boom. And so that's the echo boom I'm talking about. And that's kind of just hitting in the past 5 to 10 years. So that demographic push basically has actually been responsible for a structural increase in demand for fixed assets like housing. So when you see housing prices going up dramatically, there's a lot of reasons for that, but not all of them are ethereal or bullshit reasons that are just created by the Fed or what have you. There is actually a structural increase in demand for housing that is partly responsible for that. And, like I said, part of that is just demographic. There's been also a lot of quantitative easing on the part of the Federal Reserve that's resulted in a lot more liquidity sloshing around markets. So that's also been partly responsible. The financialization of the housing sector has been partly responsible. A lot of financial firms have used cheap and easy access to credit in order to buy houses on the margin. That is to say, borrow money and use it to buy houses, which they then rent out. And they can kind of sell those. They can sell the money that they make from the rent of those houses in markets as I don't know if they still call them collateralized debt obligations. That's what they were called back in the day. I don't know if they're still doing that or not, but basically you can sell financial products that are backed by the rent from the houses that you own. So financial firms are doing that. And for those curious, yes, that was one of the things that led to the housing crisis in 2008. But it's not as much of a problem now because there is better, at least somewhat better anyway, regulation of that market. And industry players themselves are also more aware of the systemic risk inherent in the market that helped contribute to the financial crisis, such that it's less likely to repeat itself this time. So financialization, cheap credit, demographics, um, you could say foreign investment to a degree, although that varies from place to place. There's a lot of Chinese investment that comes into Canada and the US that buys assets basically just to store value as a safe haven for their money, since, nothing is ever completely safe in China owing to the lack of rule of law. So investing in markets with rule of law is kind of a safe way to invest your money in China. But it's not just China. There's people who live in governments, who live in societies like that around the world, who launder their money or otherwise invest it in safe havens. So the United States and Canada are principal examples, and so that's one of the contributors to rising housing prices in North America. I think I read somewhere that the Midwest has become something of a haven for revenue like that, for foreign investment of that kind. I haven't read the article yet, so I can't actually comment on it, but I've seen it referred to several times now. So apparently that's also a thing. But yeah, it's not entirely sustainable in so much as it's driven by liquidity in markets. That's just caused by, the Fed and quantitative easing. But, there are structural factors there like foreign investment and demographics that also play in there. And so those forces will continue to drive housing prices higher, probably for the foreseeable future. Again, I'm not an expert on real estate. Do not invest based off of my advice. I would strongly discourage you from doing so. I actually have an uncle involved in real estate, and I remember telling him in 2020 that I didn't see any reason to expect significant inflation in the near to medium term. Because inflation, of course, is significant to the housing market because that's how you calculate real rate of return. If your housing price is increasing 3% a year, that's nice, but if inflation is going up 4% a year, you're technically losing money. So we were kind of talking about inflation, and this was back in like summer 2020. And I was telling him that I didn't think inflation would be a thing, within the next year. So obviously very wrong. So take my advice for what it's worth, not always very much. Let's see. So we had another question just pop up here. I work on a mortgage-backed securities trading desk. Okay, so I guess it is still a thing. Did he mention Freddie Mae, Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae, US GSE expansion post 2008? I didn't mention it, but that was a factor and has been a factor, just like it was before. Again, I don't think it's as much of a problem now, though, because the industry is more aware of that, systemic problem that was represented by derivative. I don't. For those of you who aren't familiar with like derivatives, derivatives are basically financial securities that allow you to bet, so to speak. I know the financial sector doesn't like gambling terms, but to a degree, that's what it is. You're basically betting on whether or not the value or price of a good or service is going to increase or decrease, or alternatively, whether or not there's going to be a debt default of some core security that you're referring to. Basically a derivative takes some other security or good or service and then bases the value of the derivative on the performance of that core other security, good, service, what have you. That's why it's called derivatives. The value of the paper basically is derivative of some other thing, some other factor. So derivatives were a major contributor to the financial crisis back in 2008 because one of the things that financial firms did in order to hedge the risk of defaults in the housing market was to use derivatives in order to try to cover that risk. And on paper, that made a lot of sense. But the trouble was that everybody was doing it at the same time, such that there was systemic risk. The risk wasn't actually being covered. It was basically just so widespread that it was impossible to cover. So a firm may disproportionately focus on investing in housing-based securities, and they may in turn try to cover the risk of defaults by buying derivatives that would mitigate losses from credit default swaps and other defaults. And the trouble with that is that the firm would then assume that they had much less risk and then invest, correspondingly. And when the financial crisis happened, hypothetically, they could have expected that they would have been covered and that their losses would have been minimized. But the trouble is that the firms who sold them that derivative that was supposed to cover them would have also been trying to mitigate their risk of defaults and having to cover that derivative by by buying other derivatives in order to cover that risk. And so there's kind of a daisy chain of buying and selling of derivatives to cover the risks of buying and selling derivatives, but also the underlying core security, which again generally was mortgage-backed securities of one kind or another. So because everybody did that, everybody was vulnerable to the risk, and eventually what happened is that when there finally was, a massive set of defaults in the housing market, there was a chain reaction of defaults amongst firms that bought and sold the derivatives that were supposed to mitigate the risk of those defaults. So one firm basically would default and they would say, well, one firm would basically have their derivatives activated and they would have to pay out to the other firm that they sold the derivatives to. And so they then would turn around and go to the firms that they had bought derivatives from in order to mitigate their risk and ask for them to cover that. So then that would happen over and over again with firms successively asking other firms to cover for them. And eventually it just daisy chained around to all of the firms until eventually they hit a firm that didn't have the money. They literally just couldn't do it. And so then when that firm couldn't cover their obligations, the firm whose risks they were supposed to be covering could not in turn cover their obligations. And then it just went back and daisy chained throughout the financial system. So that was a significant. I don't have a background in finance, and I'm sure this is painfully obvious right now to those of you who do. But this was my impression and has been for a long time about basically how the financial crisis happened. So definitely credit defaults happened, definitely Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, et cetera, and sort of the moral hazard inherent in those institutions were major contributors. But this problem with systemic risk in the derivatives market is kind of an undersung contributor. It was one of, if not the main contributor to the crisis. Because again, everybody kind of thought they were covered in the event that there was a major default crisis in the housing market. But in the event, they weren't, and they just didn't realize it. And it was that incongruence of expectations with reality that was really the significant factor that contributed to the liquidity crisis that caused all of the economic problems that came out of the financial crisis. But yeah, that's kind of why I didn't focus much on Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, rather. For those of you who are not Americans, or maybe for some of you who are Americans and who have no idea what Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and what these institutions are, let me try to. I'm going to take my best shot here. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are public-private institutions that were created by the United States government in order to help people get mortgages on homes. So basically, the idea was that the government, or more specifically, politicians, wanted to make it easier for Americans to buy a house. And if you want to buy a house in the United States, you pretty much have to get a mortgage. Hardly anybody has enough money to just pay for one with cash outright. So you have to borrow money, and so that's what a mortgage is. So in order to help Americans get easier access to mortgages, which had not always been the case, because banks don't want to just lend to anybody, right? They generally have standards. And so a lot of people could not get mortgages because they didn't have a good enough credit history, or because they were part of a marginalized group that the banks didn't really trust with their money. There are different groups and factors that went into deciding who to give a mortgage to. So the government, in order to make that process more accessible and more fair and equitable, created these institutions that are not fully part of the government. They are technically autonomous. They're supposed to be semi-independent and operate separately from the government, but they do have a government charter that connects them to the government in so much as funding is concerned. And so these institutions basically act as, I don't want to say lenders of last resort, since they're pretty big players in the market, but they kind of set the standard in the market. So they go out and they'll lend money and give mortgages to people who basically would not otherwise be able to get them. So the problem with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae is that markets kind of assumed implicitly, if not explicitly, that they were backed by the government. In other words, if Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were to fail because of defaults on the mortgages that they gave out, uh, it was assumed then that the government would bail them out, that the government would just spend however much money was needed in order to keep these institutions afloat financially. That creates a big moral hazard because it means that you don't really have to care, basically, about loans from these institutions. These institutions, thinking themselves that they might, were backed by the government, could just give out loans without caring too much about who they were giving them out to and whether or not there would be defaults. And the financial sector, for its part, had no problem with that either. If they're going to just bail out Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, then why not just buy mortgages from them and package them into the mortgage-backed securities? Because if there were a series of defaults, wouldn't the government step in and curtail losses by bailing out these institutions? So it created a big moral hazard in the industry that helped feed the market for mortgage-backed securities. That wasn't the only reason that fed into that market. The financial sector, again, thought that there was less risk than there was on account of derivatives. And so that kind of also fed the market. So even if you had not had Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, there probably still would have been a bubble in the housing market. Because in the end, a lot of the financial firms that were buying and selling mortgage-backed securities had basically just stopped caring about the underlying value, the underlying risk inherent in the securities. They just kind of bought them regardless. And a lot of mortgage firms, a lot of banks that gave mortgages, basically themselves stopped caring about who they gave loans to, specifically because the financial sector was just buying them left and right, regardless of risk. So there probably still would have been a problem even without Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, just because of the bubble and because of the way bubbles work. But at the same time, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, on account of the moral hazard, almost certainly made it worse. I have a hard time seeing how it would have made it better, So definitely that was a factor, but I just didn't focus on it much because I kind of saw the derivatives problem as being kind of more worthy of mention. Let's see. And so then there was an elaboration here, I guess. The typical convention on the street is that the mixed variety of mortgage contracts from issuers is too varied. 30-year fixed rate contracts are something like 85 to 90% of the primary market today. Prior to that, there was a greater slice of ARM and 15-year and biggest issue. IO, interest rate only contract issuance, no payments except interest for the first X years. Okay. Yeah, that gets well outside my background. I don't have that level of detail of how the sector works, how the industry works. So thank you for the contribution. I would have to read more about it. That is pretty interesting. It's gotten too varied. I thought long-term mortgages had always been the primary market, though. Isn't that right? I guess I'm
Man,
not
I live
asking.
in an apartment. I don't know shit about that, dude.
There was a greater slice of ARM and 15-year. Okay.
Neuro, your thoughts on the matter? I don't know shit about that. Thank you. That was Neuro's thoughts on the matter.
So I guess I would ask why that's happening. Why is it shifting more towards 30-year from 15-year? And I guess the other question I would have is how is that impacting financial markets today, if at all? Because I've been saying before that mortgage-backed securities are not as threatening to the financial sector as they were because of better regulation and because the private sector actors are more aware of the systemic risk that they were unaware of before. So I'm not sure what the connection here is with that. But again, not an expert on the financial sector. But it's pretty cool that we were able to get somebody to comment on it. Hopefully they can elaborate a little further on that. Thank you for the contribution. Let's see. We talked about Argentina. We talked about the financial crisis unexpectedly. It's another tangent, I guess. Oh, what did I say? I said Japan, didn't I?
Yep, you mentioned Japan earlier.
Did you know that Shinzo Abe resigned?
I did not know this.
Yeah, he did. He was the longest serving prime minister in Japan, I think since God, I don't even know, since several decades. It would have been the previous record holder would have held office decades ago because pretty much everybody else has only held it for a few years at a time. But yeah, he stepped down largely due to unpopularity from managing COVID-19 in Japan.
Hmm.
That was a big part. There was also corruption scandals and, some other stuff, but that was sort of the main genesis of his decline in popularity. So that's been some of the drama there. He was replaced by his chief of staff, if I'm not mistaken. And that was a guy named Suga. And he's very much a technocrat. He's more of an inside baseball kind of guy who generally operates more behind the scenes and deals with policy there. He's not really a politician per se. Well, he is a politician, but he's not like a outgoing politician's politician.
Hmm.
So the problem with Suga is that he just wasn't very good at managing his image. He was always just sort of dour and not very charismatic. So I remember reading when he came to power that there was some suspicion in Japan that he would not really last, because Japan has elections coming up pretty soon here. And back in 2020, when Shinzo Abe resigned, it was suspected that there would be a power struggle, uh, not only to succeed him, directly, but also for or basically for who would lead the party in the upcoming election. And again, they didn't really think Suga would be him. They figured Suga would end up stepping down. It would be replaced by somebody else. So Japanese politics, or at least party politics, has been somewhat roiled for the past year or so, while different factions have been competing with each other. I say party politics rather than politics because Japanese politics is rather sedate, relatively speaking, to other countries. Pretty much just the one party, the LDP, has run Japan almost continuously since the end of World War II. There hasn't been a lot of variety in outcomes. So most of the political competition that happens in Japan happens more so within the LDP and within its coalition partners rather than between the LDP and other competing parties.
Is it because the other parties just can't build that level of coalition?
That's part of it. The opposition has never been very coherent and they've never been particularly well organized. And
What
so
are
that's
you
kind
guys even about?
yeah. I mean, there's been socialism and kind of counterculture style politics have kind of always been there, but they've never been able to really mobilize very strongly. There was a pretty virulent communist movement for a while in the 1940s, but that kind of lost wind over time. They were kind of suppressed in various ways, and they weren't able to achieve much in the grand scheme of things, and so they lost support. They're actually still a major party now. I say major, relatively speaking. They don't have much support, but they're one of the larger political parties, technically speaking. There's a good video about that on YouTube. I think the YouTube channel is just called Cold War. It's a little mundane. But they put out a video on the Communist Party in Japan in the 1940s, and it was actually pretty cool. So if you're interested in the topic, I would definitely recommend checking them out. But yeah, other than that, not a lot of takers in terms of setting up a coherent, successful opposition. I think part of the problem, given what I've been reading over the past couple weeks anyway, is that Japanese politics is more driven by personality than it is by policy. Policy is definitely a part of it, but it seems like politics within the LDP is very factional. And there seems to be it's not uncommon for people to basically break away from the party or join the party basically just based off of transactional politics happening within the party. They'll give goodies to this guy or that guy, and then he'll join up with the coalition. Or this guy doesn't feel that he got a good enough deal in his constituency with government contracts or something. So he'll break away and maybe start his own party or what have you. It's all seems very transactional to me, given what I've been seeing. There doesn't seem to be as much of an emphasis on ideological debate about how big the state should be, or culture wars or what have you. So that style of politics doesn't seem to be all that present. So that seems to be more the difficulty. It seems like constituents, individual constituencies rather, will vote for people based off personality. And ideology and whatnot and policy is part of the attraction for individual candidates. So, I don't want to oversell the point to make it sound like there's just no policy debate in Japan. There are people who run on that and win based off of it. But it's not like in Europe where you'll have like a whole political party dedicated to a given issue, like the Greens or, liberals or what have you. And then success or failure of a given ideology is kind of measured by the success or failure of that party, or by the degree to which a larger center left or center right party kind of adopts their provisions. In Japan, it's much more of a constituency by constituency thing. One constituency cares about an issue, they'll elect a guy, and then that guy will go and it will basically sell his constituency and his vote in parliament based off of what he can get transactionally from the ruling party. That's my impression thus far.
The comment of personality over issues, I feel like that's something that I've complained about in the US, so not a totally unique problem.
Yeah, we've had a fair bit of that, more so in the past couple years, though. We were pretty well able to successfully transition away from patronage networks, which are almost always driven by personality, to transition away from that and then towards a more policy-based politics. And that kind of happened more in the 1950s. FDR and the early 20th century style of American politics was very much driven by patronage and the degree to which you could extract resources from the government and give it to your constituents. In the 1950s, the US middle class really took off and became a significant major driver of American politics. It had before in varying degrees, but in the 1950s, it really became dominant. And so that really undermined patronage networks. And, patronage networks are really most attractive to people who are either really poor or really rich. If you're really poor, you need whatever help you can get. So a patronage politician is very attractive because he's promising to give you stuff. He's promising to give you jobs or help you with your legal troubles or stuff like that. And if you're really rich, then patronage politics is awesome because that's just easy money. Your patronage guy, the politician whose network you're a part of, can give you government contracts or help you with regulations, stuff like that. It can be very lucrative. But if you're in the middle class, it's not as attractive, because you already have enough money to kind of pay your way. You don't have the kinds of money problems that poorer people have. So in that sense, patronage politics isn't as attractive. But then you're not super rich either, to the point where you're winning lots of government contracts to do stuff. So, you don't have the appeal that the rich guy has to patronage politics. So for the middle class, patronage politics is more of a net drain because it corrupts the political system and makes it harder for you to get the kind of regulatory changes that you want implemented. And it also just takes your tax money. Lots of people in the middle class are net contributors to the government's tax revenue. And as a result, if tax money gets wasted on, pork belly projects for this, that, or the other patronage network, that's just money out of your pocket. That's going to something that doesn't benefit you or the country as a whole, per se. So the middle class kind of put a dagger in the heart of that style of politics in broad swaths of the United States. I don't want to oversell the point to make it sound like it disappeared completely. It definitely did not. It still definitely exists in places like Chicago or Louisiana or places like that. Definitely still have it to varying degrees. But for the most part, there was a big transition in American politics that kind of pushed us away from patronage networks, mid 20th century. Other countries have had mixed success with making that transition. Japan is kind of a weird case. I mean, it always is, but in this case in particular, because they've got a fairly modern political system, and it's been responsive to changes in Japanese society. changes like changes from the 60s with counterculture, social changes. Japan didn't change as much socially out of the 60s as other societies did, but there was a movement towards environmentalism and towards more equal rights for women, and that did manifest in some legal changes over the course of the later 20th century. So, the political system is not particularly dynamic in Japan, but it is responsive, even if it is kind of an older style of transactional patronage politics. They have been sufficiently resilient and responsive to avoid the kind of civil society pressure that might force it to change into a political system that resembles more those in Europe or the United States. So that's an interesting history. I don't know enough about it, so I'm not going to comment on it too much more, because that's definitely something I want to read more about and kind of get more of a background in. But that's my impression of it thus far. But anyway, all of that is significant to the current transition of power, because all those different factions within the LDP are mostly fighting with each other rather than worrying about any potential opposition political party defeating them in the upcoming election. Let's see. So just recently, Prime Minister Suga stepped down. He resigned. And he actually did so for much the same reason that Shinzo Abe did. He had not been handling COVID particularly well. It was getting worse. He forced the Olympics to go through and happen when the broader part of the population was not really that interested in it. So all of that contributed to a lack of popularity on his part, and eventually he just had to resign. And so that's created a new power struggle, and the winner of that power struggle was kind of unexpected. It was a guy named not Prime Minister, former Foreign Minister Taro Kono. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. That's my best effort there. He's a member of the LDP, but he's more of a center-left politician. In general, the LDP has historically been a conservative political coalition. But of course, they have, their left and right wing like any coalition has. And Taro Kono is definitely on the left side of that coalition's political spectrum. So he's more about redistribution, that is to say, redistributing more money and other services towards the middle class, as well as just voters in general. He's more interested in increasing public spending to help with the economic recovery in the wake of COVID. And he also wants to take a harder line on China. He supports resolutions condemning the treatment of Uyghurs, and he accuses China of wanting to export its authoritarian political system, all of which is stuff that prototypical China hawks do. So he's a center-left politician, but he's more hawkish on China, which is kind of the consensus policy position in the LDP, so not that strange. But pushing for greater public spending is definitely more of a new thing. So it'll be interesting to see if he is able to kind of win election in the upcoming election, whether or not his policy preference here are going to manifest in a leftward shift in Japanese politics that we haven't really seen in a long time. I'm a little skeptical he will for reasons I'll get to in a minute here. Well, I guess I'll get to them now. Here they are. Yeah, so the way that the way that the LDP coalition breaks down, there's basically two major coalitions. And one of them is a traditional center-right liberal coalition that's called the Kochikai. And these are guys who are more popular with white-collar professionals. They're more pro-US, more pro-redistribution, kind of like I talked about earlier. This faction within the coalition is the one that largely ran the LDP through the Cold War. So from the end of World War II, roughly up until the early 90s, the Kochikai were pretty much in the driver's seat. So this is more the style of politics, the set of policy preferences, rather, that the Kochikai preferred were pretty much the ones that defined Japanese politics over that period. So that's pretty much one of the main factions in the LDP coalition. It's not the main faction anymore. And what happened is that they kind of fractured over the course of the early 90s. And from what I was reading, that largely was owed to the end of the Cold War. Anti-communism and maintaining the alliance with the United States were core components of Japanese policymaking for a long time, and were very popular. And so the Kochikai were able to leverage that into de facto control of the party and the coalition. It's kind of both a party and a coalition. It's a little complicated. But they started losing ground in the 90s owing to fracture. That is to say, their coalition, their faction just kind of fell apart and people went in different directions, started their own parties, whatnot, etc. And what they did is they lost ground to another faction called the Heisei Kinkukai, the Heisei Research Council. And these guys are more popular among blue collar workers. They're a little more pro China, and they had a populist founder, apparently. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. That's a different faction within. Yeah, never mind. Kochikai, scratch that. The Kochikai were the main faction. They ran Japan through much of the Cold War. But then they lost popularity to the Hoshu Boryu, conservative, anti-mainstream. The Japanese name is Seiwa Seisaku Kinkukai. And again, I apologize for butchering the pronunciation. So these guys are the Seiwei Political Analysis Council, and they do things a little bit differently. So they were founded originally by Nobusuke Kishi, who was actually, if I'm remembering this correctly, was the grandfather of Shinzo Abe. So it's kind of a dynastic connection there. And they were always, from the start, more about rearmament, having a more independent foreign policy, independent of the US. They were always pretty pro-US. They wanted to maintain the alliance, but they just wanted to have more leeway in the relationship, such that they could be more proactive in foreign policy rather than just kind of doing what the United States was doing, which is what they did all through the Cold War and have largely done for the past couple decades. They've done things a little bit differently. They try to negotiate directly with North Korea about Japanese kidnapping victims from the 1970s. That's a totally bizarre case, but that was something they did largely on their own, whereas previous governments would have largely done that with the United States. They also pushed missile defenses in order to counter the threat of missiles from North Korea. And they also dispatched a lot of peacekeepers in order to help with missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is, again, not something previous governments would have really been interested in. So this is the faction that has largely been in the driver's seat since the early 90s, and this is the faction that Shinzo Abe was actually a member of. So, they're kind of known for doing things like trying to remove the peace clause, well, not the peace clause, the pacifist clause of Japan's constitution. They weren't able to do that, but they were able to significantly water it down. And they've also been involved in some scandals vis-a-vis nationalist kindergartens. That was a whole weird case of corruption in and of itself. And they also wanted a carrier. I think they were the ones that did this. They wanted to build a carrier for the Japanese Navy, but their constitution actually prohibits it. So what they did instead is that they built a helicopter destroyer, which as the name implies, is a destroyer that is designed to carry helicopters.
But can it also destroy helicopters?
No, it can't. It can't destroy helicopters. It does have some air defenses, but that's definitely not what it's meant to do. It's a destroyer designed to carry helicopters that also happens to be the size of a small aircraft carrier. But technically, it's a destroyer, so it is technically legal.
I feel like we talked about this in the past, maybe a little bit.
We have.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we mentioned it before.
Because I remember joking about, like, there's a similar rule of you're not allowed to weaponize space. And you could always just play the word games of, that's not a weapon, that's not a super laser, it's just a drill. We're just going to drill rocks with this. But if it's powerful enough and you could also use it as a weapon, is it a weapon? Or is it a helicopter destroyer?
Yeah, in this case, it's definitely going to have to be a helicopter destroyer, because otherwise the Japanese legal system is going to make them scrap it. So technically, the Japanese Navy does have a helicopter, does have a rather aircraft carrier at this point. They just can't call it one. But this is the kind of sort of aggressive, well, I don't want to call it aggressive per se, but it's the kind of nationalistic, shall we say, policy program that the Hoshu Boryu faction here loves. That's the kind of thing that they've always wanted to do. They've always wanted to rearm Japan and be more independent. So no surprise that this faction has been pushing that line since they've more or less been in the driver's seat. So these two factions then, again, the Kochikai and the Hoshu Boryu, uh, pretty much their debate, their factional struggle has defined the struggle for power since the resignation of Shinzo Abe. And the guy I mentioned, Taro Kono, the foreign minister who has become the new prime minister, is actually a member of the Kochikai. And that's interesting because, like I said, the Kochikai have been out of power for a long time now. They've been in power in so much as they're part of the LDP, but they have not been the dominant faction. So it's actually a bit of a surprise that Kono was able to get the nod as prime minister. Now, there are two theories here. One of them is that they have no intention of actually letting him stay in power, and that he's going to end up getting replaced by a member of the Hoshu Boryu. But another theory says that basically Shinzo Abe is the puppet master behind the scenes. Basically, the idea here is even though Kono is the prime minister, he's not going to have enough power in order to get his way in the legislature. So, in effect, even though he's the most powerful figure in Japanese politics right now, he doesn't actually have enough support within his own party in order to make things happen. So, in that sense, the Hoshu Boryu are actually still in control. They just don't actually have the most powerful office in the country. So maybe Taro Kono is able to use his, office in order to kind of do some things that bolster his faction within the party. But most likely he's not going to be able to. So probably his appointment has more to do with the Hoshu Boryu kind of being worried about COVID-19, since that's kind of forced them to pull two prime ministers in a row now. So basically they're giving him a shit job so he can take the blame so that they can kind of swing in later. Most likely. It remains to be seen. We'll see what happens in the run up to the election, because that's when some of the drama will happen, if there is any to be had. Yeah, for those interested in some more background on this, the Hoshu Boryu are called the conservative anti-mainstream. And the opposing faction within the party was called the Hoshu Hanryu, the conservative mainstream. And there were a couple different groups within the Hoshu Hanryu, the conservative mainstream. The Kochikai were the biggest and most important one. But later on, they kind of broke it. They kind of broke into some other groups. The Heisei Kinkyukai group I mentioned before, the Heisei Research Council, that was one of the mainstream factions. And again, they were popular with the blue-collar workers. They were a little more populist, and they actually had a guy named Kakuai Tanaka, who was just a pure-blooded populist, in a mold that would be very familiar to Americans right now. And he actually jumped out and founded his own party at one point. So it was that kind of factionalism that broke the back of the conservative mainstream. See, the Hoshu Boryu, the conservative anti-mainstream, don't really have as many sub-factions like the mainstream guys do. They had the Seiwa Seseikal Kinkukai, which is an anti-constitution, pro-US, free trade, pro-business faction, which basically makes them more or less center-right. And then they have another faction, the Kinmirai Seiji Kinkukai, who are more Keynesian, right liberal, and pro-international cooperation. Basically pretty similar. There's not a lot of daylight between the factions there, so that gives you an idea of how much more homogenous they are than the conservative mainstream at this point. And if you're wondering why they call them the conservative anti-mainstream, back after World War II, center-right liberalism was pretty much the dominant ideology, so to speak. And that being the case, the previous militant nationalism in Japan was pretty well discredited. And the trouble with the conservative anti-mainstream is that while they were liberal, they tended to hew more closely to the militant nationalism of pre-war Japan. So that made them a little unpopular, and it was one of the reasons they weren't really able to leverage their policies into votes and seats in the parliament. But since the Cold War ended, they've been able to get more traction since they're the more nationalist party. And as a result, the LDP is now weighted in their favor in terms of the distribution of seats. All of that is just stuff I've read about in the past couple weeks. Because ever since, oh shit, I got something. Oh, I got that wrong. It wasn't Taro Kono. The new prime minister is Fumio Kishida. My apologies. The new prime minister is Fumio Kishida. Taro Kono is the guy he beat out, and he was the one who was the favorite to become the new prime minister. So Fumio Kishida is the Kuchiko guy, or the Kochi Kai guy. And then Taro Kono was the conservative anti-mainstream guy everybody thought would get power. So we'll see if Fumio Kishida, rather, stays in power until the new election. This has been quite the messy segment here, so I'm hoping some of this gets through. Hopefully this isn't too confusing.
We don't promise perfection, but we try our best to make the corrections. And sometimes the corrections happen in the same episode as the mistake.
I just thought it was a good excuse to talk about factions within Japanese politics, because I don't feel like those have gotten a lot of play. I don't think those are well known outside of Japan. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to kind of explore that a little bit. I wished I'd done it a little more coherently, but I think that's useful, I think. Anyway, how are we doing on time?
35 to 40 minutes.
Okay. Let's see. Anything on Australia carbon neutral goals announced last week? Carbon neutral goals. I hadn't heard them. I generally don't pay much attention to carbon neutral goals, though. Because the thing about announcing goals is that they're invariably set like decades in the future, and there's generally no mechanism to force it. Like there's no punishment, there's no penalty for failing to meet the goals. And even if there is, generally there's not really any reason to think that the government could not remove those penalties in the future. Because again, it's going to be like 30, 40 years when the goal is supposed to be reached. So I can't say anything about Australian carbon neutral goals specifically if they were announced last week. But in general, I don't think they matter because they're just set too far in the future to really be substantive. If you really wanted to implement a set of policies that would result in a carbon neutral future, there are steps you could take in the present. But just saying I'm going to do such and such by such and such time, that's really not so much a law. That's really more a resolution. So that doesn't really mean much, as anybody who's ever made a New Year's resolution can tell you. But yeah, otherwise I would have to punt on I'd have to punt on the question, not knowing the specifics of the goals that were announced.
Well, it's kind of like setting an intention. If I'm thinking about an example on more of a personal level, is you can kind of wake up in the morning and you say that my intention for the day is this, and that can help motivate you in a certain direction, but the setting of the intention is not the same thing as accomplishing the goal. It's just like a more of a brainstorming step and an emphasis step.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that.
With Australia, they have the Great Barrier Reef, which is like busted at this point. It used to be like one of the crown jewels of why people would go to Australia. It's like, oh shit, we can go to Australia, go to Great Barrier Reef, snorkel around, look at all the pretty stuff. Dead.
Yeah, it's not doing too good.
I think you need, for your average person to consider climate change a legit threat, they have to either receive legitimate issues on a personal level or they have to see stuff. Because a lot of the grander scale of like the average temperature of the earth has changed by a couple degrees, like why would they care? Like, your average person is going to think about that in terms of weather range of, okay, instead of having a 62 degree day, it's now 64. Why should I care?
Yeah.
But you lost a national treasure. Okay, we have something going on here.
Yeah, I don't doubt the utility. There's certainly, well, I don't doubt the need for action, rather. There's certainly impetus there. But, the trouble just is in the structure. You
Yeah.
know, if you really want to do something, you can. But if the best you can do is promise to do it later, I'm a little skeptical about whether or not you will.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if you had the political support to really do something substantive, then you probably would have done that. The fact that they just passed a resolution, the fact that they said that they would do it later, just says to me that there's political opposition that makes substantive action impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is there any reason to think there's going to be any less of that opposition in the future than there is now? And don't tell me that the climate crisis is going to get worse and that people are going to change their mind, because if we've learned nothing else from 2020, it's that it doesn't matter how bad it gets. People's political beliefs are very, very sticky. That is to say, they tend not to change. So I don't really buy that as a reason to think that climate change skeptics are going to be any less skeptical in the future, even in the face of potentially dramatic events.
Well, one of the things that I've seen is a backpedal, but not a concession, would be, okay, maybe climate change is real, but is it human caused or a natural fluctuation in just how temperatures change? Because if you look at millions of years, yeah, we've had warmer periods and cooler periods. So a lot of people are now pointing to that of, well, maybe that's just, it's another round of this.
Yeah, I've heard that.
For my personal take, I think it's a legit issue that we need to deal with. The thing that's tricky too, and we've mentioned this in previous Agent Smith ones, is the brunt of the nastiness of climate change, in the case that it's a legit issue, is going to be hitting the Zoomers and the Zoomers' kids and later generations. So if you're older already now, then yeah, like major industrial change in how we get our energy and that kind of a thing, it's not really going to affect you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of a just an inherent problem with politics, is that it's almost always biased in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of proposals attempting to address that would create a kind of human rights, or not human right, but rather rights for the unborn. That sounds like an abortion thing, but it refers to basically an obligation on the part of the state to take policy action to protect people in the future, even though they don't exist yet. And the idea there is principally focused on climate change. The idea is that even if there are people, even if people in the future don't exist yet, the state still has an obligation to protect them, and that failing to do so should incur some kind of consequence. I don't know how realistic that proposal is, because you would have to define, for one, who's being harmed, people in the future, how they're being harmed, and most importantly, you would have to define some kind of measure by which to determine when harm has occurred to people in the future, and then what kind of penalty is appropriate for that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's most likely where that proposal is going to get hung up and trapped. But, that is a substantive attempt, at least, to address the problem you point out. There's just not much reason to care about people in the long run. Well, not much reason to care about people who exist later, who don't exist now. Yeah, I don't know how much that problem can really be fixed. I think mostly it just comes down to activism and trying to build as much political support you can the old-fashioned way.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not that can happen soon enough to really substantively make a difference is debatable, but yeah, it's better than nothing. Got to start somewhere. I should point out that environmental economics is not my bag. So it's outside of my field of expertise in so much as I can be said to have one. Let's see. So we had a couple more questions here. So if we have time, do you think we could try to address those?
Yeah, dude, get it.
I think it's been. Oh, you're still in game. Okay.
Oh,
I
did you
didn't
want to show me
realize.
something?
No, no, no. I wanted to check to see if you were waiting for me for a stopping point, but
Oh, no.
okay. So the next question was, what direction is the war in Ethiopia headed versus the TPLF? It feels almost impossible to get reliable information out of the region. The TPLF will say they captured a city. The Ethiopian Defense Forces will deny the claim. Ethiopia says they took Afar. The TPLF denies it, etc. I don't know. I actually haven't been following like the course of the war on the ground very much because, like you say, there's just not much information. The Ethiopian government is going out of its way to restrict access to the region to foreign journalists. So it's kind of hard to get any kind of accurate information about, the ebb and flow of the conflict, who's winning, who's losing, etc. I do know that the Ethiopian government mobilized a huge chunk of people into its army uh, within the past couple months, and that was in response to the disaster earlier this year when the Ethiopian army was basically ejected from the capital city of Tigray province. It is Tigray province, right? We had somebody from Ethiopia in chat a couple months ago who was correcting me on that. The province is Tigray province and the people are Tigray,
Mm-hmm.
or is it Tigray province and Tigray people?
I don't remember which was which, but I remember hearing both of those.
Yeah. So my apologies. The appropriate, which was which slips my mind. But yeah, the capital city of, I'm going to go with Tigray province for now. The capital city of Tigray province was successfully seized by rebel forces, specifically the TPLF, among other territory in the southern part of Tigray province. And so that was a big humiliation for the Ethiopian army. I think they had been hoping that they could invade the province quickly and kick the TPLF out, arrest their leadership, and basically establish government control without too many problems in the long term. And instead, rebel forces were able to rally in the countryside. They were able to come back and push the Ethiopian army out. And it has since become apparent that it's going to be a long-term conflict of some kind, which is unfortunate. But the Ethiopian government have responded by, again, like I mentioned, mobilizing its army, and now they're basically just throwing it at Tigray province. And as the questioner points out, we don't know how much headway they've made, in the time since the offensive has begun. It's just kind of up in the air right now. So unfortunately, I don't have much to add. I don't have much to answer the question with. Um, that's just kind of the nature of things. But I can point out that it may not really matter. The Ethiopian army really kind of needs the conflict to be relatively short because the Ethiopian economy is not doing well. COVID really did a lot of damage to the Ethiopian economy because it's disproportionately dependent on the export of coffee, and the price of coffee just tanked in 2020. Um, it's doing better in 2021. So, they might get some relief in the short to medium term. But after all the economic dislocation of 2020, the government's finances are not great. And the trouble with war is that it's always been really expensive. And, the current war is no exception. And the Ethiopian government also has a escalating problem with ethnic tension in the rest of Ethiopia. Never mind just Tigray province. They've also got Oromo nationalists, causing problems, and Amhara nationalists causing problems, and some of these other groups as well. But I think those are the two main ones. So that being the case, the Ethiopian government can't really afford politically or financially a long extended war in Tigray province. So they kind of need it to end relatively quickly. So that means that the war's outcome is going to depend largely, most likely, on the ability of the TPLF to basically just hold its ground. They don't really have to defeat the Ethiopian army outright. They just need to drag out the conflict as much as possible. There's also another element at play, which is the international humanitarian element. Obviously, there's a lot of international humanitarian organizations that want to provide support to people so that they don't suffer needlessly in the war. But the Ethiopian government does not want to provide access to Tigray province to those humanitarian organizations. They do that because they don't want any of the supplies that the humanitarians bring in to go to the TPLF and its army. But of course, if you're a humanitarian, that doesn't matter as much. For you, even if some of your stuff is ending up in the hands of soldiers, some of it is also getting to the people who really need it, the civilians. And so that's a worthwhile trade-off for you. But it's not a worthwhile trade-off for the Ethiopian government. They want to starve the TPLF of as many resources as possible, as much as possible. And so that's meant an almost total blockade of the province. So not only from journalists, but also from humanitarian relief. Now, that's resulted in a big outcry internationally. There's a lot of governments, institutions, what have you, that are very upset about the government doing that for obvious reasons. And so they've started to threaten sanctions. Now, like I said, the Ethiopian government's finances are not great right now. So sanctions are definitely just going to make that way, way worse. So that basically means the government is not only on a time limit in terms of its finances and in terms of political unrest in other provinces that are going to require, the redistribution of army assets. They're also on a time limit in terms of sanctions. If the war drags out too long, then eventually sanctions really will be applied, and the government just won't be able to afford to continue to propagate the war effort. So what's going to happen then is the Ethiopian government is going to drag out negotiations about aid relief as much as possible, as long as possible, in order to buy time for the army. And in the meantime, they're going to just try to manage, ethnic unrest in other parts of Ethiopia as best they can, and try to get as much tax revenue as they can to afford, the deployment of its army in Tigray province. So Ethiopia is going for a quick victory and needs one very badly, probably sometime within the next year, I would guess. And the TPLF is just going to drag it out as long as possible, preferably at least a year, possibly longer, depending on, how well the Ethiopian government can delay things. So basically, the war is going to drag out probably at least another year, I would guess, unless the Ethiopian army can get some kind of breakthrough, on the front. But I'm skeptical they'll be able to after everything that happened earlier this year, to say nothing of last year. But they could pull a surprise. They could bring in mercenaries. That's kind of been the popular move right now. Lots of African governments have been bringing in Russian mercenaries to kind of fight rebels for them. So it could be that this is an attractive opportunity to do the same. Maybe they can break the deadlock. Although I have to point out that there may not be a deadlock. We don't really know what's happening on the ground, so who's to say? Maybe the Ethiopian army is actually making a lot of headway. But I would think that if they were, there would be a lot more headlines about the Ethiopian army taking this city or that city, taking more territory. Governments tend to brag about that stuff a lot. And I really haven't seen that. The news out of Ethiopia has been pretty sparse as it relates to the war anyway. So that kind of leads me to think that the government hasn't really made much progress. So that would seem to suggest that the war is going in favor of the TPLF for the moment. But again, all of that is just going off of very limited information. I mean, I basically just have to guess. Let's see. So just as a side comment here, if I ever don't answer a question to the questioner's satisfaction, please feel free to ask again and elaborate, and I'll be happy to return to it. I don't always read a question right or get the gist of it right, or what have you. So don't be afraid to kind of return to a question. I welcome corrections. So let's see, the next question was, how has the decline of the Yakuza affected Japanese politics policy? This is an easy question to answer. I don't know. Normally if I don't know, I can try to add some meta commentary or, maybe kind of try to tie in another topic. But, on this, I got nothing. I can't comment on that at all. I hadn't even really thought the Yakuza had declined. I guess this is a tangent, but I had read that the Yakuza is roughly divided into two factions. One of them is focused on stuff like the drug trade and prostitution, stuff that's kind of been associated with violence more. And then the other faction has historically been focused more on gambling. And what I had read, it was a long time, it was maybe like 10 years ago, so maybe this is out of date. But what I'd read is that the gambling faction of the Yakuza had actually gotten into the stock market and that they'd become kind of a big player there. So, in so much as the Japanese stock market has just gone up since then, that was one of the things Shinzo Abe did while he was in power. That was one of his arrows of reform, one of the three arrows of reform. He wanted to do a lot of quantitative easing, specifically on the part of the Japanese central bank. So that resulted in the Japanese stock market increasing in value, just because there was more liquidity being dumped on it by the central bank. So I would imagine that would only help the gambling faction, such as it is of the Yakuza. So I would wonder whether or not they've really declined in that sense. But also, I don't know. Maybe they have. So you'd have to ask somebody with a stronger background in that than me.
Did we do the disclaimer? Yes, we did.
Oh, yeah. Had to.
Absolutely.
Have to. Let's see. So there were two more here. Japan's rearmament more likely for offense or self-defense? At this point, I would say self-defense. I don't think they're really looking to go out and slay dragons. I think really, in so much as there's more support amongst Japanese for rearmament, it's because they're concerned about China. And I think that concern stems more from a more belligerent Chinese foreign policy, or at least a more belligerent discourse and rhetoric on foreign policy from the Chinese diplomatic establishment. So I think self-defense then is more what the government has in mind. I don't think they're going to go out and do like an Iraq or something. I don't think they have anything near the public support to be that adventurous. Yeah, so it is mostly, I think, more down to regional political tensions. And let's see, the last question here, do we have a racial gender patronage system in America now? No, I don't think it's racial or gender. I think I know what the questioner is kind of getting at, but no, I don't think that's the case. I think there is overlap between patronage networks and, say, race or maybe progressive liberals to a degree, but I don't think so, really. I think it's just a typical patronage system that's just sort of evolved organically to encompass those groups in certain localities. I don't really think you can say there's a gender patronage system at all. I don't think progressive liberal political groups vote for patronage. You can say that they vote for reforms that are favorable to them, things like allowing more protections for trans women in the military, just as an example. But I don't really see that as patronage per se, because that's not something that that constituency needs to thrive. It's something that they want in order to achieve equality. If women did not have favorable access, I'm struggling with the right terminology here, but basically, if there were not as many protections for women in government, which is the kind of patronage that a patronage system could provide, they would still be able to get jobs in the private sector, most likely. There would still be protections for them in that sector. I guess you could call those protections themselves patronage, but I don't really think of it as being that. I guess it comes down to intent. Because if you're poor and you're voting for a politician in a patronage network, you're doing it specifically because you need or want money or access to something that will give you advancement. But with progressive liberal feminism, for example, it's really more about equality and ideology. It's not necessarily just about the money or just about self-advancement. It's about creating what they perceive to be a better society.
Well, that connects with some of what we talked about last time about the different waves of feminism and how third wave of feminism is expanding the purview beyond just stuff like suffrage and right to vote, and more so like treatment of people, which isn't money per se. It can be like fighting for equal pay, but a lot of it is also how we interact with each other beyond just transacting business and money and stuff.
Yeah. So I think the difference there is that it's with again, in this case, feminism, it's more ideological. Whereas with a traditional patronage network, it would just be nakedly self-interested and driven purely by money, almost purely by money anyway. I think you could make a better case for racial patronage systems because there are a lot of constituencies in the United States that are mostly, I mean, African American is probably the more common one, but there's probably some Hispanic constituencies by now as well, like communities in LA or Dallas or what have you. Uh, and so in those, especially though in the African American communities, some of them have been so poor for so long, especially like the ghettoized communities that we were talking about earlier. A lot of them are very poor and so have no qualms about basically voting for politicians that explicitly offer them patronage. And it doesn't quite happen as bluntly as it used to back in the early 20th century, but now it kind of happens more indirectly. So, as an example, something like DISD in Dallas, which is the school system here, the Dallas Independent School District. A lot of the jobs there kind of go to people who are maybe not politically connected per se, but the jobs are kind of geared towards the African American community in Dallas. It's I mean, there's a lot of African Americans in the actual city of Dallas, so it makes sense that there would be African American workers there. But politically speaking, the city of Dallas kind of implicitly treats it as a jobs program for people in the African American community, as well as just the poorer parts of the community in general. And that's had some mixed effects on the quality of DISD, unfortunately. But that's the kind of patronage that patronage networks in inner cities provide. They provide government jobs and they provide subsidies. And yes, they also provide uh, things like affirmative action or other racially relevant type of policies that are meant to contend with racial prejudice in to one degree or another. But I would not consider that to be like purely racially driven. I think it has more to do just with the state of the community. I think if you found better off African American communities, uh, they would not seek patronage like that, and their politics would reflect that. There would probably not be nearly as much corruption in the policy-making progress. They would probably resemble middle-class politics and other equivalent white communities.
Well, one thing that you mentioned earlier was the middle class as being a strong force against patronage networks because those networks benefit the rich and the poor, but not the people in the middle class. And going back a few years, I guess in Agent Smith, we talked about the middle class, the black middle class in Atlanta being a really
Yeah.
strong force, and how
Mhm.
if they're able to pay their bills and expenses and all that kind of stuff, they don't really need money from the wealthy, and they're not wealthy enough to start throwing money around. So all that kind of stuff would not be great for them.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. It's a good example of what I'm talking about. Just like a African American middle class community that does not vote according to like patronage.
Hmm.
And to kind of round out that thought, can we consider something like affirmative action or other race-based policies to be a form of patronage in so much as it is giving an advantage to a community? And I would say in that case, it depends. Because if you're really poor and you need, some pathway to advancement, and in so much as racial prejudice is a block to that advancement, then yes, you could consider that patronage. But if you're well off, if you're like a African American doctor, you make enough money, you live well, but you're still going to vote for, most likely anyway, you're probably still going to vote for people who provide things like affirmative action or other similar policies because racial prejudice is inhibiting the progress of your community. And so that's not really patronage in that case. In that case, it's more ideology, I guess. It's more striving for equality. So in that case, it more mirrors the feminist example that I mentioned earlier. It's not driven by a desire for self-advancement. It's more of an ideological desire to create a more equal society.
Mm.
So that's what I meant at the start when I said, there's overlap between patronage and, racial-based politics. But I would say that race-based politics in ghettoized cities, for example, African American communities that are very poor, I think they support race-based policies to a degree for patronage, but they support other forms of patronage as well besides race-based politics. And in general, they support all of it just because they need support because they're poor. So yes, we do have some degree of racial patronage systems in the United States, but they're not purely racial. I would say they're defined a lot more by income. And in that sense, they're not really any different than any of the other patronage systems that have ever existed in the United States.
Well, cool. So it seems like the biggest things we hit today were Eastern Europe and Japan. With the visit to Africa, and we talked a little bit about the housing market, which a general theme with world discussion is, since it involves the whole world and everyone has their limited perspective, we're going to be non-experts about most of this stuff and very non-expert about some of it. So thanks for bearing with us. If you have anything to add or correct, we welcome that kind of thing. We're not here to be firebrands who are telling you how to think. We're trying to figure out the world and be able to talk about it in there was a description in the chat by Moss, thank you again for handling questions, saying that Agent Smith, while you don't share all the same biases as Moss Neotech Prototype, you are distressingly fair in your takes on things, and he respects your takes.
Well, thank you, Mass Neotech. I appreciate your support and your perspective.
And your level of distress.
Your level of distress. I'm sorry it's distressing. I hate to think that I put people off, but yeah, thank you for your input.
Well, I get the same thing whenever I try to, basically you're trying to understand the other side. This happened a lot when COVID was first hitting and people were talking about masks and vaccines and stuff, and I would try to articulate the line of reasoning for someone who chose either not to get the vaccine or chose not to wear a mask, and they would be like, how could you say this? You're enabling them. Ah! It's like, I'm just trying to articulate the thoughts that people have in their head and to humanize them. If we can make sure that we all consistently see each other as human beings, that gives us a really good edge in being able to build bridges and understand one another. Find some common ground, pick each other up, that kind of a thing.
Well said.
Yeah, we try to be neutral, but bear in mind we're not perfectly neutral. And as was pointed out last week, this is a very American show. Are these two Americans talking? Yes, actually, that's where we're from. So please forgive our ignorance. Appreciate you coming on again, Mr. Agent Smith. Always a pleasure. Are you going to go trick-or-treating tonight?
No.
Oh. Did anyone visit your house?
I do that as a courtesy to my neighbors. I'd hate to think how scared they would be if some fat middle-aged man popped up in the middle of the night asking for candy.
Did anyone visit your place, though, looking for candy?
I don't think so. I didn't hear the doorbell go off.
Oh. Well, did you have a bucket outside that said take one?
We didn't have one outside, but we did have one inside.
You had candy inside, okay.
Yeah, we were going to hand it out, or so I'm told. I was just going to turn the lights off so they'd skip the house like I would normally do, but I'm told that the neighborhood has improved significantly and that there's many more children and families and that I should make a good impression on them by participating.
Make a good impression by being the haunted house on the block with all the lights off and cobwebs in the windows.
Well, by providing candy, yeah. So that was the objective, but nobody really came, so I guess I'm off the hook. I can continue to be hermetical.
If you're handing out candy, aren't you really just building patronage networks in your neighborhood?
To a degree. For at least one day a year, I'm a powerful local political broker.
Look at this, the younger generation always asking for handouts. Well, you take care of yourself, sir. Happy Halloween, even if you're not the most festive on the block.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure, sir. You have a good night. I'll see you next time.
Take care, and we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. Halloween edition.